바닷가에서 보낸 1년.
Following the numerous atrocities of the century's first half that had impeded, if not downright made impossible, any progress, South Korean cinema finally saw its own golden period during the 1960s, coincidentally, a period coinciding with heavy governmental control in all areas, designed to economically as well as nationalistically restructure the country following the May coup of 1961, for which cinema, as a tool for cultural propaganda, long discerned by various prior leaders, presented itself as the perfect medium. The result, given said goals, seems unsurprising: a flood of pictures in which directors resembled assembly line workers more than artists. To really get a grasp of the output at the time, it would be apt to compare to modern times. Let one consider Hong Sang-soo, who seems a prime example of prolific output in contemporary cinema. Since 2010, undoubtedly his most prolific period, he has released 23 full-length features with 2 additional 30-minute short films, averaging out at roughly 1.6 films per year. Compare these numbers to Kim Soo-yong, who completed about 61 of his 120 films between 1960 and 1969, resulting in an average of 6.7 films per year over the 9 years, reaching as high as 10 in 67 and 9 in 65 respectively, and suddenly Hong's resplendent catalog seems nothing but a derisory footnote. Such does immediately invoke the philosophy of studio system Hollywood, in particular the careers of various now long forgotten B directors, and indeed similar were Park's aspirations for the establishment of a vibrant, proficient national cinema. However, unlike the Robert Flores and the Ray Nazaros of the world, Kim Soo-yong constantly collaborated with some of the bigger figures of Korean cinema, be that Shin Song-il in Mist, Shin Young-kyun in Seaside Village, Yoon Jong-hae in Splendid Outing, or Kim Jin-kyu in Confessions of an Actress. As it were, every film tended to have at least one tangible, recognizable star. The unsung born Kim Soo-yong was always prolific, even during his time in the South Korean army during the Korean War, where he, assigned to the film department of the Chung-hoon Bureau of the Ministry of Defense, produced and what would forward his later output several military educational films before then later transitioning over to the cinema, releasing his first full-length feature in 1959. To him, it was a desire to portray the wretchedness of the war conditions he had experienced which led him to the cinema. But however idiosyncratic as it seems, the history of Kim's extraordinary output cannot be solely expounded by his own proclivities. Instead, it is intrinsically linked to contemporaneous developments in film policies. Following the May coup, the landscape of Korean cinema changed virtually overnight, streamlined by the creation of the Ministry of Public Information just mere years later. The ministry originally was tasked with the role of administering the National Film Production Center, one focused on hard military propaganda, and the 1962 inaugurated Motion Picture Law, which would prove a crucial creation for it would dictate the output and strategies of the following decade. The Motion Picture Law instantiated Park's principle of national identity and therefore limited the number of foreign imports in 1965, as well as enforcing various other laws and screening quotas for Korean films and theaters. Restrictions and requirements for production studios grew strenuously over time, to the eventual point of the dissolution of many smaller and medium-sized companies. The inevitable consequence thereof was the emergence of a subcontracting process between registered and independent producers, known as daemyeong, in which the former sold their production rights to the latter, enabling films to be made and quotas to be filled. Another crucial implementation was the reward system of 1965, intended by the Park regime to reward so-called high-quality cultural propaganda films. Recipients of such honors would be permitted to import a number of foreign films. Such gave these cultural films a double incentive, both financially as well as artistically, since they were treated as quasi-art house films to be showcased at various film festivals, thereby bifurcating the output into serious works and throwaway quickies. The base for many of these films were novels, resulting in the term literary film. Artistic for their superficial realism and relative ambiguity, yet bound by the uniqueness of their governmental origins, had led Ae-Gyung Shim to refer to them as a hybrid of propaganda and art film. This area of literary film is precisely the market in which Kim Soo-yong, albeit perhaps coincidentally, thrived in. One of his earliest literary films, released in 1963, Bloodline would already set much of the formal foundation of what was to follow in the following decades, namely a favoring of atmosphere and ambience over narrative, or the conflict between the aesthetic and the practical within commercial cinema. Set in a borgate-like courtyard following the end of World War II and colonial rule in Korea, Bloodline is a family melodrama of the age-old conflict between old and new that is experienced in 3 different families. Widescreen photography, desperate to capture the free landscape, initially takes precedence over narrative progressions and are highlighted by Kim's focus on a family of impoverished North Koreans, an abnormality if not linked to political propaganda at the time, go about their days, destituted but solitudinous to an extent that torn South Korean counterparts can't seem to attain. His 6th film of 1965, Seaside Village, ranks among Kim's most celebrated and concentrated efforts, that is simultaneously a perfect example of the cultural propaganda envisioned by the Park government, remarked as having transcended local issues and provincial tastes while simultaneously providing a window onto different culture by festival critics upon its release. A sense of social integration, perhaps the highest praise the government, whose political methods favored anything but that, could have hoped to attain. The film portrays the lives of villagers on an island off the coast of Korea, more particularly the ways a number of widows who lost their husbands out at sea cope with this newfound solitude. Forced to disregard death, the remaining men return to fish whenever the ocean roars, perpetuating a cycle of agony. But of course, men are not the focus here. They never are in Kim's films. Hyae-joon, a widow who lost her husband only 3 months after marriage, is followed more intensely. With no choice but to live alone and support herself, she joins the widows' diving community, before later seeking love again and reaping the consequences thereof. Again, Kim remains more interested in the atmosphere of the provincial setting, feathered by local accents, folk songs and rituals, as well as the overarching togetherness of the widows who endure and loudly celebrate their endurance, where survival is something to celebrate. Being a commercial film, Kim taps back into traditional narrative beats with heavy melodrama in the latter half, where a contrast is built also through the change in location. A perfectly open sea makes way for the narrow mountains and forests, where the solace of the 2 innamorati eventually lead to death. What remains in Seaside Village is the inexorability of nature, that which cannot be escaped, yet merely allayed by whom one chooses to suffer with. Mist of 1967 coincided with a period in South Korean cinema following heavy efforts towards industrialization, where modernization finally became to be noticed. Accordingly, Dazed is Kim's directing, which may differ from prior film but rests on a similar emphasis on atmosphere. The world Kim creates at Mist in particular proves him to be a true author rather than an economically driven director, where he takes the novel by heart and translates it, not formulaically, which seems the inevitable fate of many adaptations, but rather to the way his medium of choice, the cinema, allows it to flourish. The story appears very simple. Ae-Gyung, who is married to the daughter of the president of a big pharmaceutical company in Seoul, takes a short trip to visit the hometown of Mujin, while his wife tries to close his promotion deal. There he reckons with his and accordingly South Korea's past and present. At first glance, Mist feels distinctively at home in Italy, with portrayal of bourgeois inertia key characteristics of Antonioni or Bolognini, but Kim uses such influence to comment on the increasingly westernized influences of post-war South Korea, itself of course only a small pawn within the Cold War, whence tradition was gradually replaced. For this, Mujin does not represent a hearth of the past, and likewise the contrast between Seoul and Mujin does not rest on meretricious notions of tradition versus modernity, as much as they do on modern versus want to be modern. The critique lies in the desperation to catch up, from which Mist attains its meaning, in detailing the slow decay of a form of life ephemerally captured during its death. By 1977, Korean cinema had abandoned and moved past the literary film. In 1969, the government ceased official support for them, after which most films began to disappear. Kim, however, remained interested in their potential, proven by two of his finest films, both released in the same year, Splendid Outing and Night Journey. Night Journey acts as a spiritual successor to Mist, primarily in its modernistic style, but it is now a female-led melodrama of rediscovery, punctuated with aesthetic disruptions and a reoccurring score that pierces narrative beats with horror-esque industrial sounds. If Mist was languid, then certainly Night Journey is its volatile cousin. The film deals with bank worker Lee Hyung-jo and her clandestine relationship with one of her co-workers, who refuses to publicize their relationship for the sake of comfort. Accordingly, she's continuously denied even the reassurance of being desired by him, felt in her various sexual initiations that invariably lead in dissatisfaction on her part. Following the marriage of one of her co-workers, she takes a vacation back home, where she attempts to rediscover herself. It is there where Kim's authority takes over. He allows the film to jump between episodes of flashback and premonitions that spatially and temporally divide. And act as impetuses for her attempts at reclaiming her desirability. Larry Paquet observes, more than any other performance of the 1970s, Yeon's character embodies the frustration and lost opportunities of ordinary people living under authoritarian rule. Regarding this, the color palette as well as Joon's sartorial style are often presented in elegant color, whereas the office she works at is at a constantly tepid grey, usually existing within dull, medium shots. The visual difference is clear, yet the point again is not the simple juxtaposition, but the equation of the two, her dissatisfaction despite superficial differences that suffuses modern Korea. Glance back at with modern eyes, the golden era of Korean cinema leaves behind all but a few films. The Housemaid, A Day Off, and Obaltan remain frequently quoted, but Kim Soo-yong, amidst the plethora of his output, is a voice to be rescued. His emphasis on atmosphere connects him to other European and Japanese auteurs of the time. In him lies not an interest in realism but a desperation to pierce into reality. His translations of novels create worlds to be felt, first and foremost, and how could anyone do anything but feel for the heroines in Seaside Village or Night Journey?